Holden, welcome.
Thanks.
Do we live at a special time in history?
As far as I can tell, yeah, I think so.
What convinces you of that?
Well, I guess I started thinking about this when I started thinking about a lot of these claims that we hear about AI being a big deal and maybe transforming the world forever. And, I think one of my initial reactions was, well, if that was true, that would imply we live in this weird moment in time. But then I started looking into just in general where we stand in the history of humanity, and I think we do live in a very weird time. So one thing is if you just kind of like sketch out a timeline of the history of the universe and you mark milestones like the first life that we know of, the first humans, and then a bunch of like scientific and technological discoveries, they just like they get very close together. And a lot of the most significant events are just very recent. If you zoom in on human history, it's like, humanity is maybe 3 million years old, maybe 300,000 years old, depending on how you count. Human civilization is like 10,000 years old. Um, but most of what we tend to think of history and most of what I consider kind of the most significant events in history in terms of technology changing, the world changing, um, human quality of life changing are from the last 200 years or so since the Industrial Revolution. So I think just if you just make any timeline you want, make any list of significant events that you want, it will be you could have some bias, but it'll be very hard, I think, to escape that conclusion.
Now, people might think, okay, so a lot of stuff is clumped in the last few hundred years, but maybe just it's going to be business as usual for, thousands of years or millions of years to come, right? Like, oh, growth, GDP growth or productivity growth is a couple percent a year, a few percent a year. What's wrong with that way of thinking?
And something I should have said too is I was talking about kind of milestones, so like invention of big technologies and big events, but some people might be concerned that those are biased and that we're biased in a certain way. So you can also just look at numbers. You can look at energy consumption, global energy consumption, or you can look at global economic growth. And what you'll see is that basically, we've almost never in history had anything close to 1% global economic growth per year until the Industrial Revolution 200-300 years ago. And since then, we've had something much closer to a few percent a year growth. And the thing is, I think a lot of people, when they think about the future, what all they know, all they've experienced is a few percent a year growth. And so all they expect is a few percent a year growth. And if you look at a chart of the last 100 years, you'll just see a few percent a year growth. You'll see kind of a straight line on a log chart, and that's what you'll expect. But if you zoom out, what you see instead is you see very low growth that accelerates in a very dramatic way. And we're at this part on the chart where it goes vertical. And I've kind of on my blog, I've kind of produced a bunch of these charts. Um, and I think that suggests that the future is just much more uncertain than people tend to model it as. It wouldn't be that crazy if the next 100 or 200 years see a radical divergence. An explosion in growth might be what you would predict if you naively extrapolated the trend, actually. If you look at the whole trend and extrapolate it, you would project explosive growth. And there's been papers making that argument. You could also expect things to collapse, and people have argued that they will. But I think this whole thing is just, I think when people imagine what the future is going to be like, they think about all they've ever known, but all they've ever known is a tiny fraction of human history.
My understanding is that you go a step further and you argue there's no way that it could be business as usual for the next 10,000 or 20,000 years. Why is that?
Yeah, that's another thing. I mean, I think a few percent growth might not sound like much, but if we, civilization being about 10,000 years old, if we were to have another 10,000 years of a few percent a year growth, in my opinion, that just if you believe that's going to happen, you have to expect incredibly wild, weird things to happen. Um, this argument was originally made by Robin Hanson, and I kind of have a revised version of it on my blog. But it's basically like you end up after a certain number of centuries, if you have a few percent a year growth, you would have to find a way to cram like, hundreds of times the economic value of the world today into like each and every atom in our galaxy. You're not going to be able to find more matter. You're not going to be able to get more atoms because in that time, you won't be able to get outside of our galaxy. It's too big and you can only go so fast. And the speed of light is a hard constraint there. And so you could, it's like, can you come up with a story for how, for each atom in the galaxy, we are creating hundreds of times the economic output of the world. You could theoretically, but I think the more you meditate on this and the more you think about what would it look like to have a few percent a year growth for 10,000 years, the more it feels like that's a very, very weird thing to expect. And it seems much more likely that we'll either get some kind of stagnation or some kind of collapse at some point, which may follow an acceleration.
This is a great example of how exponential growth is so deceiving, right? When you're in the exponential growth, like you're on the exponential, it doesn't feel like that crazy, but then you project it out not that long and you're like, wait, no, it actually gets ridiculous. We saw this with COVID too, where people are like, oh, it's only 2 cases. It's only 4 cases. It's only 8 cases. You're like, okay, what's happening? Suddenly everyone in the world is going to have it, actually. Let's go into these different scenarios a little bit. So if we believe that we're not going to get to the 10,000 years of 2% growth, which is just, it seems ridiculous if you actually project out the implications, right? So one idea is a stagnation. So. And, a lot of times when people will say, well, if you have an exponential, it's not really an exponential. What it is the exponential portion of a curve that tapers off, of a logistic or something like that.
Yep.
So just walk us through that scenario a little bit.
Yeah, so there already are some signs, I think, that we are probably getting like slightly slowing global economic growth, and certainly like per head or something. Like if you imagine that growth is kind of a, especially if you imagine that innovation is a function of the number of researchers, we have an exploding number of people working on innovation, people doing research, and we're not getting a commensurately exploding amount of productivity. I think there is a general dynamic that I think holds up pretty well anywhere you look for it, that when people are innovating in a field, the innovation becomes harder over time per head. It's like the same number of researchers are going to make fewer breakthroughs over time. And that's just, I think, best explained by low-hanging fruit dynamics. It's just if you just started thinking about physics, then you can roll some balls down some inclined planes and learn something you never knew before about how the world works. If you're at today, in order to find any experiment that might shed light on whether the standard theory of physics is right or wrong, you need very expensive equipment, you need long experiments that take a long time. There's just not as much to learn as there was before. And so I think it's not at all hard to tell a story where even though the world is becoming more sophisticated, even though we have a lot more minds trying to do research and innovation, we have found a lot of the low-hanging fruit. We have discovered some of the easiest things to discover. And what we're going to see is just slowly leveling off growth from here into the future. That is definitely a future. I don't think it's a incredibly wild future, but it is a future that implies that like the last 200 years are kind of like the fastest growing years of all time, which I think would be an interesting part of history to be in.
Yeah, it still suggests we're in a special part of history, but just special in a different way. Yeah. Special in the sense of this incredible
the last hurrah.
Growth. Yeah, the last hurrah. Before we like pick all the low-hanging fruit. And tell us about this model of low-hanging fruit, like how you think about innovation and what leads to new breakthroughs.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of discourse on the internet, I think, where people will kind of point to some interesting facts. They'll say, it's interesting that this pretty tiny city, Athens, in Greece, in a couple thousand years ago, produced so many legendary works of art and science. And if you were to get that kind of output per head out of today's population, you just have a crazy amount of innovation. And so there's some kind of argument that today's greatest minds are somehow less productive than those ancient Greek minds because there's so many more of us and we're not coming up with as much stuff as they did. At least if you look at it through, what the history books consider significant, which is debatable. You see that dynamic just everywhere. I mean, you'll see that pick any period and pick any field, and you're going to see that the per head output early on is higher, that a lot of the biggest breakthroughs happen early. And I think there is a tendency for people to kind of interpret that and say, this means our society is losing its way. This means things are getting worse. It could mean that, but I think there is just a very solid, easy, simple explanation to hand, which is this low-hanging fruit thing. And I think it's pretty consistent. I think it's just the fact that you see pretty much steadily output per head in research going down over time as more research is done in like any field you look at. You see it in art, you see it in science. I think some people think it can't apply to art because that's something different, but I think low-hanging fruit dynamics apply to art as well. happy to talk about that. I think it does give you an explanation for that. And so what this kind of leads up to is that there are people who ask, what would it take for the world to have a lot more research progress? What would it take for the world to have a huge acceleration in innovation? And some people say, we have to get back to what we used to do well. We have to get back to how the ancient Greeks did it. My point of view is maybe, probably not. But I'll tell you something that would give us a ton of acceleration is if we just had a lot more researchers. We just, we could have such an explosion in the number of minds working on the problem that it could outweigh the low-hanging fruit dynamics. I think if we had, billions of top quality researchers in a field, then even though you're getting less output per head than you used to, you would get a heck of a lot of output. And I think that's the kind of effect we could see from AI.
Right, because you can imagine AIs that start to play the role of junior researcher, for example,
or a senior one,
or senior eventually, and then you spin up, not 1,000 of them, not 1,000,000 of them, but like 100 trillion of them, or whatever. Some ridiculous, you get to some ridiculous number long into the future, and then maybe that's a way we can stay at that really high accelerating growth curve for a really long time. But tell us, so you made all these plots of like kind of plotting innovation of different types over time. And what would you expect to see if there really were these gilded ages where like certain periods, they're just much better at creating great thinkers? And how does that match or not match what you actually show in the plots?
Yeah, I think if I believed that there were these like special cultures that did amazing things and got much more output per head than the rest of us for kind of amazing magical reasons, I think I would just expect to see a little more chaos and unpredictability when you plot kind of output per head from some area of innovation. You'd expect that, some areas have their golden age in like the 1950s and some of them have it in the 1750s. And it's kind of, there's no rhyme or reason to it. And if you draw a chart of, innovation per head, it kind of goes like this, or, does something random. Usually what you see is you see an up and then a down, a quick up and then a gradual down, which is you see some field that wasn't a field, didn't get much attention. People weren't very interested in it. Then people got interested in it. They piled in. And then it kind of went slowly over time. You just see that everywhere you look. It's not 100% universal. But I mean, I have a post on my blog where I look at it for music, popular music, classical music, literature, movies, science, different fields of science. And it's just like, it's always kind of that same general story. Not 100% of the time, but that's pretty much what it is. You might also just expect to see more variation, I think, across place. I think there is a lot of variation across place, but in general, kind of countries that are pretty wealthy and educated and interested in science produce a lot of science. Within those, the output per head, it'll vary by a factor of 2, factor of 3. It's not varying by a factor of 10 generally. My kind of basic model is just like, if you didn't know anything about this, you might just guess, look, if you want more innovation, you should have more people trying to innovate. And I think that's probably like most of the story, plus the fact that innovation gets harder over time.
I have a totally anecdotal observation, which might be wrong, but it just feels to me like at certain points in the past, people were smarter, which is really nonsensical because like we have so many more people now and, education is so much more universal now. But like when you look at an Einstein and you look at like the kinds of things he did, it just feels like, holy shit, is this almost unbelievable? Like in his early, I think it was like his early 20s, he publishes these 3 papers that like each of which is just such an incredible achievement. And it's like, yes, we have incredible physicists today, but it's just like really hard to say that they stack up to an Einstein. And, I feel this way, about like, John von Neumann and, about like Gauss. And I feel, like a bunch of people in history, it just feels like people today don't stack up, especially politicians. I mean, politicians, it's almost ridiculous. Like comparing, Biden or Trump to, Alexander Hamilton, who wrote like 50 essays about inventing new, forms of democracy or whatever, right? So, but actually, as I was rereading kind of some of your blog posts, I started thinking, maybe what's going on here is that the kind of thinker that works in sort of the area where you're like picking the low-hanging fruit is just really different. And you kind of bring this up in your blog post. And maybe these sort of like polymathic geniuses, maybe they seem so smart because they were so smart in a sort of polymathic way, which was the kind of thinking you needed to do innovation then, which is different than innovation today. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I I tend to not agree with this impression, and I think it tends to be a bit of an optical illusion of various
Mm,
kinds. So one of the things I think is just like when a field is new, you have the opportunity to just come up with these like game-changing, impressive sounding, field-defining insights that once you hear them, you can never think about the field the same way again. And so when you look at what Einstein did or you look at what Isaac Newton did, you're kind of you know it was a big deal, but you also already understand the insight. And so it's just you're giving them credit for this incredibly foundational idea about the field. And when people have found a bunch of insights like that, like they just don't have the same opportunity to be impressive because they're not finding things that are as big and foundational in general. So I think that's a chunk of it. I think some chunk of it is like, well, you mentioned politics. I mean, I think a lot of stuff that is broad audience has gotten just people speak in like I don't know less nuanced, less intellectual ways because they have a bigger audience now, and maybe just because they're doing their job better. I mean, I think as a politician, you probably don't want to sound like someone that Holden really enjoys listening to and thinks sounds really smart. I think you just want to sound understandable. You want to appeal to normal people. Um, you could use the phrase "dumb down" for what a lot of popular entertainment's trying to do. So I think that's a genuine change. And then I think there's this polymathic thing you mentioned where it's like part of the thing I think about is like there's music that is incredibly innovative and that a music nerd would appreciate how it's like different from what came before it. Then there's music that's just broadly appealing and sounds nice. Um, Both of those kinds of music are getting made today a lot. People are doing a lot of both today. If you're a music connoisseur and you just are obsessed with music and you're looking for the latest thing that's different from what came before, there's lots of cool stuff. And if you just want things that sound nice, there's a ton of stuff. But music that does both at once, I think is there's a certain number of times you get to do that. And then as
right.
time goes on, there's less music you can write that's like that because sound there are fewer things you could do that both sound really nice and are something really new. So I think this is a combination of things, but I will tell you, I mean, overall, an area that I find a little less prone to optical illusions is social science. So basically, a way that I feel is like when you're trying to compare physics discoveries of the past versus the present, you've got this whole confounding factor of what it is that they discovered and what was available to be discovered. When you're reading literature, you have this whole confounding factor of like, well, if you read something that was the same as Shakespeare today, you wouldn't be impressed. So you're trying to factor in novelty and you're trying to think about was this really new? And I think people do that involuntarily, which is often why a sequel to a movie that's identical to the original isn't as enjoyable to people. Um, when you're reading social science, a lot of times I read social science and I think less about like, is this innovative? Is this different? Is this a contribution? Is this impressive? And I think more about just like, does this make sense? Is this person making sense? I think today's social science is so much better than yesterday's social science on that dimension. I think it's been getting radically better, consistently better. So I tend to feel like there's just as much and probably a lot more intellectual talent around today, and it doesn't produce all the same phenomena that we associate with these exciting discoveries.
When you say social science, I immediately think of psychology because that's my field. What do you focus on in particular in social science?
Stuff like economics, but people trying to do causal inference, people trying to ask the question, okay, does school cause people to learn more, and does what causes a country to grow more or whatever, what causes what, and trying to understand the world by using this kind of like sometimes economic data or sometimes social data. And so this is just a thing where people have to make arguments. Hey, I think A causes B. You might have thought that it actually causes C, but I'm going to argue that it doesn't. And it just like I'm a person who just for my job has been trying to critically evaluate studies for now I guess a couple decades. And it feels game changing. It feels like 20 years ago I would read stuff and just feel like I was lost, frankly, in a sea of bullshit. Um, and today, I mean, there's still a fair amount of bullshit, but it just feels so much easier to follow what people are saying. It makes so much more sense. It addresses so many more objections. And I think it's higher quality in general. And I think it's pretty steady too. Like when I read stuff from the 90s, I'm just cringing.
Do you feel the same way about psychology? Or maybe you don't read enough of it to know?
I don't pay as much attention to psychology. I think psychology always kind of struck me as just a science that was in a very bad state. Like I do remember, I mean, I had kind of a private blog maybe 10 or 20 years ago where I was just like, I just think this whole field is like not working. I think a lot of this stuff just doesn't make sense. So, and I haven't really paid attention to it since, to be honest.
Got it. But yeah, in terms of causal inference, the ideas of running a randomized control trial came really late in history. I just learned the other day from Adam Mastriani that the theory of relativity was invented before like randomized control trials were being used regularly, which is kind of mind blowing.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah.
Well, inventing and using regularly though are extremely different things, right? Like part of the reason people don't do randomized control trials, they're a big pain in the neck.
Well, that's true. Yeah, I think
science,
the idea wasn't even widely known or understood at that point. So yeah, in terms of causal inference, and like all the econometrics methods of like instrumental variables, regression discontinuity. I mean, these are relatively recent inventions, and finally, getting used regularly, I think.
Yeah, and of course, you could make a criticism of what I'm saying. What I'm saying is too generous to the present, because people know about these new methods and they're using them, and so that's not them being brilliant. That's just them using methods. But I mean, I still have this sense when I'm reading stuff. It's not even just about are the methods they're using. It's like, are they making sense? Are they kind of like explaining themselves in a way that is compelling?
The
a lot of that might
reasoning.
just be tricks of the trade. Yeah, quality of the reasoning.
Yeah.
A lot of that might just be tricks of the trade people are picking up from each other. But my own subjective impression of the world is not so much that older stuff seems better, and that may be just how relatively much time I've spent reading social science.
Do you think people generally give the past kind of a special treatment, when they're looking at art or music or writing or even science, that we're not evaluating at the same metric, even if we think we are?
I think some people tend to do that. I mean, I think there's some interesting, I think, like Our World in Data page on declinism. Just people always think we're in a state of decline and things are, falling apart. And I think in some ways things in the world are getting worse, and in other ways they're getting better. I think it is a bias. I think another interesting thing to look at is sports. I think I also covered some of this in the same blog post is, in general, if you look at lists of which athletes were considered significant and which athletes I think most people would say were good, you're going to see a very different result from if you look at things that are like highly objective. And the highly objective things you'll see in general, like athletes are improving over time. They're better today than they used to be. And when you look at more subjective people saying, who was a great athlete, you're going to see more of like, I think something a little bit more even, but maybe even a bit weighted toward the past. So I think if you took some of these, legendary athletes like Babe Ruth and transplanted him into the modern day, I don't think it'd be bad. I think it'd be good, but I doubt he would be as dominant a baseball player as he was back then.
Okay, so stepping back, so we've been discussing this idea that maybe we will get sort of a flatlining. Like if we don't end up growing our population tremendously or building AIs to replace us, maybe we will get a flatline. Are there any other reasons to think there might be kind of flatlining progress, or is that kind of the main argument?
Yeah, I mean, again, some people would say, look, civilization's falling apart. We've lost the wisdom of the ancients and we need to worry about stagnation. I would just say, look, you don't get multi-percent a year growth forever. You can't. And we had a really good run. We found a lot of, exciting insights. And unless we explode our population or our virtual population a lot, we're not going to keep growing at that pace. That's a breakneck pace. So that's it's a difference of opinion. But I think stagnation is highly plausible. I think it's very unlikely if we build AGI soon, but I think otherwise it's highly plausible.
Regarding we actually keep accelerating along this curve for quite a long time, maybe not 10,000 years, but quite a long time. Do you see any other way to get there besides like artificial general intelligence, or do you think that's pretty much the only way that we're going to, for hundreds of years, have this kind of acceleration?
There's lots of things that could happen. It could be that I'm wrong about this culture stuff. It could be that we just find new fields that are so fertile that we make incredible progress. But I think just on kind of like a simple, naive model, I tend to just think, look, like this is where I'm starting and I haven't seen the evidence to kick me out of this. It's just the more minds you have trying to innovate, the more innovation you get. This is somewhat offset by innovation just gets harder as you go because you're finding all the easy to find stuff. And so if you are if you are wondering how we get an explosion in innovation, that's probably an explosion in the number or the quality of the minds working on innovation. And the most plausible way I can think of to get a real explosion in that, just like a huge, not like our population growth went from roughly flat to 2% or something, but a real explosion in the number of minds. Yeah, that would be something like AI would be definitely the leading contender there. And I don't know if this is something we're talking about that we're hoping for or not hoping for. I remain quite conflicted on it myself. So I think there are people who are very interested in what would it take to get accelerating innovation. What would it get to take faster innovation than we have today? And I sometimes think these kind of people, if we do get AGI soon, are going to be a little bit like people who, farmers who would pray for rain and pray for rain and pray for rain and then pray for the floods to stop. And I do think there's historically, I think innovation, economic growth at this few percent a year pace have been good. I am a fan, and I would like more of them, and I would like more on the margin. But I think if we suddenly build something that's going to dramatically, make that go vertical, I'm not sure that's a good thing. I'm not sure we have a basis for assuming that'll be a good thing. And I think in general, I think we should be treating the future with more radical uncertainty and more attention to things that could be game-changing in good or bad ways than I think many in intellectual circles tend to.
It seems that a lot of people want to fall back in a heuristic. Like, look at history. Like, productivity is good. It makes everyone wealthier, and now they have food to eat, and now they have shelters easy to get, etc. But I think you're suggesting that like that's actually a relatively short time period that the data is based on, and it's not necessarily the case that like the future is actually going to be like that. Like we might just be doing all of our learning from this really special era.
Yeah, I should first say that I do agree with that. I mean, I agree with it more than I disagree with it. Or it's like there are debates that happen today where some people would say, economic growth has made the world worse and productivity is not helping us and we're not getting happier and blah, blah. And I take the other side of that. So I have a series of posts also on my blog where I talk about this question of has life gotten better? And it's multiple posts covering multiple time periods, but I tried to pull it together into like one chart of has life gotten better? And one thing I think is like, since the Industrial Revolution, I think life has definitely improved more than it's gotten worse. It's been a good thing. And I think if we're talking about more of that, I would be in favor, not against. I think more science and technology, more economic growth, probably good. But I also think it's possible to be overconfident about this and taking this too far. I think the agricultural revolution probably made life worse. And so I think if you draw a chart of what quality of life looks like over time, it's kind of like, we don't know, got worse with the agricultural revolution, then we don't know, then we don't know, then we don't know. Then it shot up over the last like 5 seconds, and now we don't know what's next. I think it's completely fine to have a default guess that more growth is good. I think it's unreasonable to say there's no way it could be bad, especially if really crazy stuff like artificial general intelligence happens.
You mentioned that you think life actually got worse with the advent of agriculture. Could you dig into that a bit?
Yeah, all of this is guesswork. So all of this is kind of like if we were making a chart to decide what trend we're extrapolating, what are we doing? But I think with agriculture, I mean, I tend to be a person who thinks about intellectual topics like this in terms of like, I'm just going to start with the simplest guess, and then I'm going to look at where nice concrete data makes me change my mind. And I'm mostly not going to entertain fancier theories that we just don't know anything about. So people have all kinds of speculation about how there was more meaning or there was less meaning, and people were in these, hunter-gatherer bands, and was that good for their, we don't really know what that was like for their psychology. Certainly when I imagine myself living that way, it seems horrible to me. I wouldn't want to be stuck around a small set of people my whole life. But we just don't know. When you look at stuff we can measure, I think in general, violence, it seems like the best we can look at. I mean, it got worse. It maybe like doubled or something like homicides per capita.
Got worse with agriculture? Or?
Yeah. Yeah. In general, violence looks a lot worse with sedentary societies, like societies that camp out in one place and don't move around a lot. There's some arguments that maybe we were sedentary for longer or in more places than people generally recognize, but it's generally believed that, early humans were mostly not sedentary and became more sedentary after agriculture. And so the totality, I think, of the evidence does suggest that we saw a lot more like violence, a lot more homicide per capita, which I think is a pretty decent, it's not the only quality of life measure. It may not be the most important one, but it's pretty measurable for something that you can learn about from that long ago and that tells you something about quality of life. I think also height, I think maybe also got worse. I'm not even sure I'm getting that right, but that would be maybe like a marker of nutrition. And I think there is a general view that, that the roving bands of people, I think just they had less population growth, and that may have been a big part of it, but they generally probably were like a little better fed.
So it might be that pre-agriculture, these roving bands were less likely to get into violence, which kind of makes sense intuitively because, like, if you've got a neighbor and you're next to them, like, yeah, that's going to create friction, right? But if you just kind of are going, you're like, okay, we don't like these people, we'll just leave, right? If you're a roving
I think the
band, it
bigger
seems like it's
theory is the
easier to, yeah.
accumulation of possessions. I think it's more
Ah,
like
okay.
once
Okay, yeah.
people started staying put, it was like you could accumulate all this wealth and have these like
Mm.
very vast hierarchies of power, and then you could fight over who has the power. And otherwise, it's like when you can't get that much more powerful or that much more wealthy than someone else, then I think these kind of more egalitarian norms develop.
But I guess maybe part of the argument is that if these agricultural societies actually were worse for people for a while, but
Yeah.
had higher population growth, they maybe just out competed the other ones.
Yeah, that's the argument. Basically, like an agricultural society, it's yeah, you've got more people coming. You're like going to be, more successful in war and stuff like that, and you're doing worse. Maybe because you have more people, and maybe because you have more resources to fight over and to have, hierarchy and inequality over. So, this isn't stuff we know, but I think it's just I think it's a best guess, and because I think it's a best guess, I think, people saying, "Hey, I think science and technology and growth are good. Let's have more of them." I'm like, yeah, I'm with you. That's our best guess. People saying like they have to be good. Like, there's no way that a new technology could be bad. I'm just like, this just doesn't. If you look across long enough time period, I just don't know where you really get that.
This reminds me a little bit of some of the. I remember you have the side project around utopias and like looking at utopias. And the one thing I recall from that is like it's pretty easy to get people to agree on things they don't want in utopias. Like we don't want horrible diseases, we don't want poverty, we don't want famine and hunger. But it's like much harder to get people to agree on what you want. And early technology looks like people not starving to death, right? People not dying young
Yeah.
from preventable diseases. But maybe like as technology gets more and more advanced, it like becomes less clear what are we removing that's bad and what are we
Yeah.
adding that we may or may not want, right?
Yeah, I think that's very possible. So when I did try and do a big survey and make a big table of what got better and worse over the last couple hundred years, um, I think there's a lot of like just like we don't know. We don't know what happened to like relationship quality. We don't know really what happened to friendship quality, or we know very little about what happened to happiness. But a lot of what we can see is that people became just like better fed, and more healthy, just like less disease, less starvation. That's really good. I think there's other things we can see too. I think we've seen some nice progress on like civil rights and various forms of just recognizing, like, expanding our moral circle and giving more rights to people who previously didn't have rights. So those are good things we've seen. Those may or may not have been like downstream of just generally a lot of marginalized populations becoming like more empowered, maybe because they had a lot of their basic needs met. We don't know this. But I have wondered if maybe at a certain point you kind of run out of one kind of juice to make life better. And there are ways in which I think new technology has made the world worse. I think in general, probably there's more people who have problem with addiction today than there were in the past. And you can define addiction a bunch of different ways, but in general, it would make sense that as your society becomes better at doing everything, it also becomes better at laying traps for people, creating things that hack into their brains and their bodies, so they want something that they shouldn't really have, that isn't really in their long-term interest. You've seen obesity on the rise, drug addiction, just a lot of stuff like that. So some people have a theory that social media, for example, is not doing what previous technology has done to reduce hunger and disease, but it is creating a new addictive thing that is bad for our long-run mental health. I think that's like very plausible. I also think it's not a sure thing, because another story that we see across macro history is there was a lot of stuff that looked bad until there was a response, and then it got better. So air pollution, if we'd been having this conversation 100 years ago, I might have said, well, progress is good in some ways, but the air pollution is going to kill us. It's just bad. It's so bad. Air pollution is going to get worse and worse, and air pollution got better, and kind of in a disappointing way, or in an unsexy way. It's just like, why did air pollution get better? Well, it's like, well, air pollution got bad, and then people didn't like it, and then they did things about it. They passed regulation, things like that. So I don't know where we are in the social media story. I won't be surprised if 50 years from now we say, social media looked like it was bad for people for a while. Then everyone recognized it was bad for people. Then we started banning phones in schools. We started putting in all kinds of controls, and then things got better. And actually, it's another story of technology winning. And now people just use social media to have an easier time finding their life partner. But it's also possible to look back and say, gosh, we were on a good run when technology reduced hunger and disease, and then started having less of that juice and just started making people more addicted to things.
It's interesting to think about online dating. In my opinion, in the early days when online dating first started existing, some companies arose like OkCupid that seemed like they were really trying to solve how do you match people to most compatible people. They could fill out hundreds of questions, and you could customize your own match score based on how much you cared about. And then it just feels like everything fell off a cliff. There's these conglomerations that start buying up all the companies. And then you've got Tinder, which really seems to gamify it. And so instead of being about find your life partner, it's about play this fun game of trying to find a match. And it just seems like somehow we just no longer are optimizing for the right thing, even though in theory, the technology should be much better today for optimizing to find your life partner. Something about market dynamics has pushed it off of that track.
Yeah, I don't know a ton about online dating, but I think a big issue with it is just that it's a huge network effect thing. So if platform 1 is just better designed, but platform 2 has more people on it, you definitely want to be on platform 2 every time. And so it's all about just how many people can you pull in? How many people can you get to engage? And so a thing about OkCupid, people like you and me think it's cool because you get to nerd out and you get to spend a lot of time on it, and it seems like a good idea. But I think you want customers who are lazy and easy to engage, and something like Tinder, it just takes less effort. Then it gets more people on it. And then when you have more people on it, you're at a big advantage. So I don't know exactly what to call that dynamic, but it is just it's an incentive to make products really easy to use and really simple. There's some great post by some unknown blog that's about a character named Marl, who is the marginal user, and it's just painting this picture of this person who they're on their phone and they're just scrolling and scrolling and scrolling and scrolling. And as soon as something makes them think or makes them make a choice or isn't immediately engaging, they howl and rage and they turn their phone off, and you lose as a company. So, there is something where we're catering to a certain kind of person, and there's a competitive effect. Yeah.
That's an interesting point. And you could imagine that, okay, maybe the products actually are getting better for the marginal user. They're just worse for edge case users. So overall, maybe things are better. I would argue that online dating, I don't think that's what happened. I'm sure it is better for the marginal user in the sense of user interface. But I think that basically they just make less money if they quickly get you a really good match. And so I just think actually long-term incentive. Yeah. I think long-term incentives move towards just gamifying it.
I would probably take the other side of that. I think if there was a website that was really good at getting people married, you would probably go to all these weddings and hear about the website, and you'd probably want to use that website. This isn't my area. I would guess it's just such a common pattern in digital products that when you make it easier to use and less effort and more just optimized for people to just click without thinking, those products tend to outcompete the other ones. But I don't know.
That's interesting. Yeah. Well, I think one argument around this is that Tinder just gives you way less information. People are judging based on this tiny little, thin slice of data of what does the person look like.
I've never used it, but yeah.
Yeah. Versus older apps where it was oh, there's a whole profile and there's all this information. So going back to sort of is technology, good, bad, harmful, whatever. Nick Bostrom has this urn model where, you imagine every new technology is drawn from an urn, and some of them are white balls that are just great technologies. They just make things better. Some are gray balls that are kind of mixed, social media. And then sometimes you draw a black ball, which might be end civilization, right? What do you think about that model?
Yeah, I think it's a plausible model. I think the argument Bostrom is making is that it might be that there's like some technologies that just as soon as we invent them, we all die or something, and it just wipes out all the good the other technologies have done. Um, I think this might be true. I'm not sure what it means because I kind of feel like if we were, this is not something we've observed to date. This doesn't seem true to date. It seems like most of the time we build things. Some of the things we build are dangerous, but it seems like most of the time things are working out for the better. And we haven't built one thing that just like blows everything else up. And I think if we were to try to kind of like set a public policy to say we need to make sure we never get the blackball, I would kind of feel like just the cure is worse than the disease there. I just like that's just not a we don't have a particular reason to think this is the world we're living in. It could be the world we're living in, but we would be sacrificing a lot if we were to design policy around assuming that's the world we're living in.
I guess if AI kills us all, we'll be like, whoops, I guess they're blackballs in the errand, right?
Yeah, and I think it's definitely a thing that could happen. It's not something that I think is like more than 50% likely to happen. I think AI could be very good or very bad. I wish we are being more careful with AI in particular. I don't really wish we had a global policy of just like no new technologies because one of them might be the black ball or something like that. I'm not sure. There's probably other regimes you could have, just like an intensive monitoring authoritarian regime where you can invent anything, but then we're going to intensely control who uses it. But most ideas I've heard for making sure you never get a black ball, I mean, they sound worse than taking a risk of getting a black ball to me.
Yeah, I guess you've got the don't allow any new technology, and then you have like the Amish model, which, as I understand it, is not don't ever allow new technology, but like vet each technology and only add it if it like you see a really clear reason to add it, which is like one step. It's very
Sure.
authoritarian still, but it's one step low. And then you can imagine a whole spectrum of like, well, only certain technologies get flagged as potentially dangerous.
Yeah.
Like maybe, if they're developing new ways of creating viruses, maybe you're like, yeah, maybe we should flag that one as like maybe worse than other technologies and like have a much like more careful rollout or something like that.
Yeah, my view is that I would be against any highly general attempt to make sure technologies are safe. Like my sense is the benefits of just letting people invent things and use them generally outweigh the costs. I am in favor of identifying foreseeably high risk areas and being extra careful there. I think that bioweapons are a foreseeably high risk area. I think that AI is a foreseeably high risk area. I think maybe that's roughly it in terms of stuff people are working on today or anywhere near today. So I'd be like I mean, this is kind of not a very simple view or something, but I'd be kind of fine with a world where we were just incredibly careful about bioweapons, incredibly careful about AI, and quite permissive about everything else.
Regarding bioweapons, do you, in terms of your concerns about the future of the world, do you put that, like, is that something that takes a lot of attention? Or would you say you put it way below AI? So it's sort of like, it's a concern, but it sort of doesn't come close to AI as a concern.
I don't know how to quantify these things. I would put in a way that I think would add more, information than noise. I would put it like noticeably below AI. I think AI is like more likely to matter more and on a sooner time frame. But I wouldn't put it like so far below that we should ignore it. I think it's a really big issue and really needs more attention than it's getting.
Yeah, it seems like COVID was kind of proof of concept. Obviously, that was not made. It was not
Yeah.
intentionally made as a bioweapon.
Right.
Obviously, there's a debate about whether it was
Yeah.
humans were involved in making it. That's ongoing. But it is sort of a proof of concept of like just the amount of incredible damage that bioweapons could, in theory, do. And
Yeah,
then you could say,
exactly.
well, maybe that wasn't even from the basket of like pandemics. Maybe that wasn't even a particularly bad one, right?
Yeah.
Like there have been much worse ones in history. So although we kind of if you look at history, you should have known that things like that happen. Now, at least we have
Yeah.
like in our lifetime a visceral example of that, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you could have known it before, right? I mean, Open Philanthropy started a biosecurity and pandemic preparedness priority program, and a lot of that was because people around us were yelling at us to do it, 5 years before COVID or something like that, because we were like, well, what are some of the worst things that have ever happened in the world that have killed the most people? I mean, it's mostly world wars and then pandemics, the Spanish flu, the Black Death. So you could have known this before, but yes, there is a vivid reminder in our recent past that there's really nothing quite like a pandemic in terms of just something that can come out of nowhere and cause unbelievable amounts of damage. And I do think COVID is among the worst natural pandemics we've ever seen, and certainly one of the worst of the last century, but is nowhere near the worst we could see, especially if people start deliberately engineering bioweapons.
Do you have an opinion on whether we've, as a society, have really learned the lessons from COVID? Like, if there's another pandemic that's of COVID level, would we handle it much better, or do you feel like
Yeah.
we're going to bumble it?
I feel like we've learned nothing. I feel like we've maybe learned negative things. I think it's I'm kind of shocked at how little has been learned from COVID. It just feels like um I mean it was kind of like at first when the pandemic hit, I was kind of surprised at how on the ball people seemed because the world was moving with much more agility than I had expected to kind of make dramatic measures like lockdowns. And the original justification of lockdowns was this kind of people were sharing this incredibly viral graphic of flattening the curve. That's like, if we can just slow this thing down a little bit, we'll make sure the hospitals don't get overloaded. Cut to 6 months later, the hospitals aren't overloaded. They're nowhere near the hospitals are being overloaded, and we've still not got kids in school. What was the thinking there? We've got like public parks closed, even though it's safer to be outdoors than indoors. Potentially just doing a ton of interventions that I think had very bad potential effects on people's education, on their mental well-being, on their ability to have fun, while at the same time, I think not doing many interventions that would have been very low cost. I think there could have been more of a focus on air circulation, having windows open, having air purifiers compared to masks. That would have cost very little. I think it would have like slowed the spread of the pandemic a lot. So yeah, it's just kind of sad. And then after COVID, I think Congress was getting together and they were thinking about, well, maybe we should pass, it's like the Biden administration made a request for something called the Apollo program for biodefense and had all these ideas to develop better personal protective equipment and far UVC light to kill pathogens. And there were all these ideas for how we could stop something like that from happening again. And what we ended up doing was nothing. I think we ended up just saying, well, no, we just don't care, and we're just gonna pretend this never happened. I mean, that's as far as I don't see the world doing anything to prevent the next COVID or even to do anything differently next time.
If that's true, I mean, I think one thing that's really surprising about that, you'd think at least it'd be much more palatable for voters to say to voters, look, we had a pandemic. We've got to do something about this. Before COVID, it's like all theoretical, right? Like you can see why before COVID, it might be hard to rally people, but like surely voters like must be on board with that.
They could have been, yeah. I don't really understand it, and I think some of it's just random. The lesson. I'm not taking away the lesson that like the world never reacts to anything or it doesn't matter when something happens, but I have trouble pointing to anything that happened as a response to COVID that represents really being in a position to do something well next time, other than I guess mRNA vaccines. I mean, it was an interesting story because it feels like we screwed up so many things, but the hard tech side of things went pretty well, and that was the biggest win of the pandemic, was just like getting these vaccines done in record time and rolled out actually quite well and quite efficiently. That was pretty cool. I do sometimes think that we may be headed for kind of a similar situation with AI, where we kind of screw everything up except for maybe some technical stuff on how to make sure AI doesn't do things we didn't intend it to do. And if we get lucky there, it could make up for a lot of stuff.
Speaking of AI, some people who are really concerned about its future really push on the policy side and say, okay, what we need is like good regulatory frameworks, or they push on sort of cooperation. We need like, all the governments to work together and not be adversarial. We don't want race dynamics, Yeah. Others are much more focused on sort of the technical aspects and saying, really, these are technical problems. Like, we can't really count on governments to solve the thing. Like, we have to actually figure out how to build things safely. Like, do you lean one way or the other on that, or do you sort of see them as equally important?
Well, they're definitely complementary. I mean, if we can build, technical measures that make AI safer, then that gives us more to work with when people are proposing legislation aimed at making AI safer. And, going the other direction, regulation can create incentives, it's like the FDA regime has made it so that if you're a drug company, a ton of your effort is going into safety and efficacy trials. And we could imaginably have that for AI. So they're complementary. I think relative to other people who work on AI, I may have a model that's a little bit more open to kind of total failure on the regulatory front and still being fine because we had some successes on the technical front. I have a post on Less Wrong called "Success Without Dignity," which is kind of a play on the "Death with Dignity" post by Eliezer Yudkowsky that just I still stand by. That just kind of spells out like, look, here's how we could get a very happy ending despite a very pathetic response.
One thing that really impressed me that you did is I remember back in the day, a whole bunch of people were trying to convince you to care about AI, that like it might be really important for the future, it might be really dangerous. And you did not buy the arguments. And you wrote long, I think you wrote a lot about why you didn't buy the arguments. And then, years passed and you completely changed your mind. At least it seems to me you completely changed your mind.
Yeah,
And I so rarely see that kind of thing happen, especially when someone has like publicly written about their view and why they think it. So maybe you can just talk a little bit about like that transformation. Like what changed your view? Was that difficult, or do you not find things like that difficult? Because I think most people find things like that incredibly difficult.
yeah, I appreciate it. Let's see. I mean, when I first started hearing the AI concerns, I mean, one thing is I just like didn't see any signs that we were anywhere near the kind of AI people were worried about, the kind of general AI. Um, so that changed my mind a lot when I started to feel that we were. I think I also just like I think I had a bunch of intuitive reactions to the arguments people made, and I felt that I didn't get good responses back when I gave them. So it felt like a lot of the people around me were like assuming that AI was going to be like maximizing something or was going to have goals when it didn't seem to be necessary that it would. Um, and then I think I later learned stuff that just made me more, I don't know, not think it was definitely true, but think it was like more likely than I had before that AI would kind of the way we're actually going to end up designing it could end up having its own goals and could end up just being incredibly opaque compared to other software that humans write, so that we have like no idea what's going on inside it. And I tried to do kind of a two-stage update. So I think a thing that I generally spend a lot of my life thinking about is just like who should I be listening to? I don't have time to figure everything else for everything out for myself. I don't have time to do my own research on everything. Usually my approach to thinking about things is I do enough of my own research that I feel like I have some grounding or standing to start figuring out who's making sense and who I should listen to. And then I mostly listen to those people on the topics where I've decided I should listen to them. So it's kind of a mix of thinking for myself and not at all thinking for myself. And so anytime I change my mind, I have to simultaneously think, okay, what is it I thought that was wrong? But also, who is it I thought that was wrong that actually was right? And I need to think about that. And so that was a two-stage update for me. And yeah, I think some of the people who I still have many disagreements with, who are known as AI doomers, but like, oh, I think they just like were way more insightful than I gave them credit for initially. And after I made the update, I like took them much more seriously and, I don't know, tried to get the money and stuff like that. So yeah, was that hard? I mean, I think in some ways, I think it's one of these things. It's a little bit like working out or something, where the first time you kind of have to admit you're wrong is painful. But if you keep doing it, you kind of reinforce this. You get used to this pattern in which something feels a little scary, but you'll feel better after you do it. Things will be better after you do it. That people will actually appreciate you changing your mind rather than just deciding that you should never be listened to again or making fun of you, and that you're just going to feel better every day because now you're just like working on something you really believe in and doing something for reasons that are really right, and you don't have to spend the rest of your life kind of like dancing away from something. So um yeah, I don't know. I don't think it's ever particularly easy to kind of like admit you were wrong, but I think the more you do it, the easier it gets.
Something I like to think about is I kind of imagine the world where like I'm wrong and I keep believing I'm wrong and I compare that, but it like feels good. Like I'm like happy because I think I'm right. For the world where
Yeah.
like I find out I'm wrong and I'm like, oh man, that's embarrassing. And then I like
Yeah.
start believing the correct thing. And I just like so much prefer the second world. If like think about it,
Yeah.
like the world where like I actually changed my mind and then like it feels bad for a little
Yeah,
while, but then
definitely.
yeah.
I mean, I feel the same way, although also just being totally frank, I mean, I think as a younger, more ideological person, I probably cared more about that aspect of things.
Mhm.
And now I probably just like instinctively care more about my quality of life and stuff. But the other thing I'd say is it's just like the pain and embarrassment of changing your mind are just like really short-lived. And
Mhm.
the kind of like the feeling of just being like, all right, I did that, I've moved on, and now I'm doing a new thing. It just people let you change your mind. They don't hold it against you forever. I mean, some people do, but screw them. And it is actually not really a sacrifice. It is just better, I think, for long-term quality of life to just, it's like eating your vegetables or working out or something.
We don't even see that many case studies of this, right? Like you find lots of examples where someone does something really shady and then they apologize. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about just like someone
Sure.
being just totally wrong on a topic and then
Yeah.
publicly being like, yep, I got that wrong. Here's what I think now. Like, it's hard to even point in like, the public sphere to examples where it's really an epistemic thing.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's true. It's true. There's not a ton of there's definitely examples, but there's not a ton of them. It's interesting. There's especially not, I think a lot of people like when I read people saying they were wrong, I think a high percentage of those are either like, well, I was wrong about this narrow thing that I made a bet on, but I still stand by the overall idea. Or there's a decent number of people who make posts that are like, I am so sorry. I should have listened to myself more. I had an inner voice telling me what the right answer was, but I went along with everyone else like a sheep and said what everyone else believed. I should have listened to it. It's like, that's like, I mean, the thing where someone is just like, I thought this person was an idiot, but I was the idiot, and I should listen to this person more. Yeah, that's kind of rare. I don't. I mean, I see it, but it's kind of rare.
This also touches on your approach to learning, which I think is a very interesting one. And it leads you, I think, to have a lot more opinions than other people. Do you want to just tell us about that?
Sure. Yeah. This is another thing I've written some blog posts about. I mean, the way that I tend to learn about a topic is I call it learning by writing. So the thing I tend to do is I tend to just like I always have an opinion on something. It's involuntary. I just look in my head to see what I already think, and then I try to write it down. I try to write down what I think, and then that raises research questions. Because then I'm like, wait, I wrote this down, but like, what if this thing I wrote down isn't true? Why do I think it's true? How well could I justify it? What about this counter argument? Blah blah blah. And then I come up with a bunch of stuff I want to learn more about, and then I'll do a bunch of reading. And it's like I'm always starting by putting my opinion out there, and then after a certain amount of critiquing myself, I'll put it out to get critiques from others. So I'll send it to friends, or eventually I'll publish it. And that's a great, this is like what's it called? It's someone's law, Cunningham's law or something. That the best way to learn something is to say the wrong thing and have someone correct you.
Yeah.
So this has always been like how I go through life is just when I want to be educated on a topic, I just start by like expressing what I already think and then learning about all the ways in which I'm wrong. And I do find that way more efficient and effective than what I think a lot of other people seem to do or seem to want to do, which is like more to like do this very intensive reading and learning and listening period before forming an opinion. So a corollary of this is like, I actually find it kind of a weird idea that you would like pick up a book, open it to page 1, then read page 2, then read page 3 until you've read all the pages in the book and then close the book and say you've read the book. I find like for a novel, fine. I actually find that like kind of a strange idea for nonfiction. It's something I almost never do. I'm much more likely to kind of like skim a book, try and read the intro very carefully, get the basic idea of what it's saying, and then like think about it and then like read some criticisms of the book. And then as I read the criticism, I'll be like, wait, but what did it say about that? Then I'll go back to the book. And then I might end up reading like one chapter like 5 times really carefully. And skipping a bunch of other chapters that's like, even if I agreed with this chapter, it wouldn't change what I think. So I don't care. This doesn't matter to me. And so it's very hypothesis driven. It's very like, I am trying to figure out what I think about this topic. Here's what I currently think. This book contains some stuff that may be relevant to what I think. The stuff that is relevant, I'm probably going to read 10 times. The stuff that's not relevant, I'm probably not going to read or I'm going to skim. And yeah, I kind of find the idea of reading books weird because it feels like if I have done that earlier in life and I occasionally do it now, but it feels like when I read a book like that, the normal way, I don't remember much. I don't retain much. And when I do this other thing, it's like I've paid a lot of attention to the parts that are important to the specific thing that's important to me. It's easier to learn and it's easier to integrate what I'm getting.
Well, it seems to me you're sort of doing a different thing than a lot of people are doing when they're reading books. A lot of people, they're like, I want to I want to have read this book. I want whatever this book does to me, right?
Possibly,
whereas you have something you want to like know about the world. Like, for example, you have an opinion and you want to see if it holds up, or, you want to scrutinize it with respect to, the arguments in this book. And on your point that a lot of people seem to like feel like they really need to dig into the information before they form an opinion. I think you're totally right. And I think this is something about myself as well, that I think I have like way more opinions than most people. And I think you probably have way more opinions about most people because I think we both feel comfortable forming an opinion when we don't know very much.
Yeah.
And I think it sort of sounds bad, and in a way it can be bad.
Yeah.
But I think it becomes better if you say your opinions are held with like different strengths. And sort of like there are tons of things I hold an opinion into, but I could be like my mind could be changed incredibly easily.
Yep, exactly.
Because it's just like my first guess, right?
Yeah.
But if you don't have an opinion, go ahead.
It's a high embarrassment way to go through life. It's like I always have opinions, even on stuff I don't know about. I often sound confident even when I'm not. And then, I'm always going around being like, I think this. And then people are like, what about that? And I'm like, and there's you have to be ready to do this thing of saying, oh shit, I was wrong, or else like having opinions all the time is just going to be deadly. But yeah, it's like it's hard for me to imagine another way of learning that would be nearly as effective or efficient. I feel like if I tried to read everything first and know what I'm talking about first, it just like I would be too unfocused. I would be picking up all these random facts that don't have a particular application. I would have too much trouble holding on to them. Maybe I'm just not smart enough to operate that way. I don't know. But I do try to operate the best way I can to form a good picture of the world.
Well, I think there's another thing that a lot of people feel like you have to know enough to have an opinion. Do you know what I mean? So there's a credentialist aspect, and I, as an extreme anti-credentialist, I like don't experience that. But I think a lot of people feel like, well, who the hell am I to have an opinion on this? And like, isn't that almost obnoxious? Like I've read like a couple articles, and then there's world experts who've devoted 30 years to studying this topic.
I'm not very anti-credentialist. I'm maybe like a moderate on this. I mean, I think it is completely fine to have an opinion before you know anything. I think it can be rude to like be forceful in certain ways with that opinion, or to use that opinion to take very high stakes actions when you don't really know very much about the area. So I think it's very reasonable to say, for example, like, well, Spencer has an opinion, and this person who has a PhD in the field has an opinion, and I'm going to listen to the person with a PhD in the field. Like, that's like a pretty like reasonable thing. It does depend, and you have to use your judgment, because I think there are some topics where I would listen to you over a person with a PhD, because it's just like, are we talking about something where where the knowledge of specific things you learn in a PhD program is really relevant? So I think that's appropriate, but I think, it really matters what the context is. If someone is out there and they're tweeting stuff, I mean, that I think is fair game, and they're out there. Maybe what they're doing is they're just seeing who argues back at them, and they're treating it as a learning experience. If someone is going and making really high stakes decisions based on something, then I do want to know how much they've consulted with experts.
Yeah, and on the credentialism piece, I think it would be ridiculous to say that the credentials don't provide evidence of what someone knows, right? Like clearly someone who's a PhD in physics knows a lot more about physics than your average person on the street, obviously. And I think where it starts to come into play is more like, for me, if I've talked to someone for an hour about physics and they don't have a PhD, I feel like I can update a lot on how much they know about physics, and like have, so I will, like, the fact that they don't have a PhD like won't matter so much anymore, because like I either now think they don't understand physics, or I think that they do have a good understanding. You know what I mean? Whereas I think some people, like, they get stuck on the credential, like they have trouble updating past the credential.
I think it just depends on kind of like how much energy you have to actually get up to speed in an area. So for me, it just varies a lot. I mean, there's areas I know super well, and in those areas, I think I don't really care what credentials someone has, because I can just listen to what they're saying and think if it makes sense. Then there's areas where I know very little, and it just would take me a lot of effort that I'm not going to put in to even know what the heck I'm talking about at all. And in those areas, I tend to be more credentialist, because it's like, I can't just like, I actually will get it wrong. Like if I listen to two people argue and I'm like, this person's making more sense, I think I will get it wrong if I don't have a certain baseline of knowledge and I haven't put in a certain amount of time. So you have to just decide, what are the areas where I'm like actually trying to know what I'm talking about, and what are the areas where I'm fine to just kind of like make some bets based on superficial aspects of what someone knows. You have to think about what areas matter to you.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Like, you have to know enough to be able to vet people, right? If you literally know nothing, then you can't tell the difference between like a total fraud and like a world expert, right? It's just, they might sound indistinguishable, and they might sound equally kooky even,
And
right?
it depends on the field. I
Yeah.
think in some fields, you could probably spend a day learning and you'll already be able to tell who's making sense in an argument, in some arguments. And then I think there's other fields where it's just like, well, you better spend 5 years. Otherwise, you can watch two people argue and you'll have no idea who's making more sense. And, any judgment you make will just be noise. I mean, if you see people arguing about a really abstruse part of theoretical physics or something, or a piece of mathematics, I mean, for me, I probably would have to study for years to have any more than noise judgment on that argument. So you have to decide what are the arguments I want to be able to actually have an informed take on who's making sense and who doesn't.
On the way that we learn, I think you and I have a lot of commonalities, but some interesting differences too. So we both form a lot of opinions, and then we both try to like vet those opinions and update them and change them. But I think you're much more like strategic on the research front of like, okay, I've got this opinion. Let me go read a whole bunch of sources that like, might give me the opposite perspective and like vet it against that. Whereas I think I do a thing that's a little bit different where I often will have like a thought in the back of my head for years, like, oh, I think this thing might be true. And I just notice like, as I'm going about the world, reading things, talking to people, I notice like, that didn't fit that. Like, I wonder what that actually says about that. And then when I go to write, it's often because I've been thinking about something for like 3 years and I've like now feel like I've accumulated enough that I'm like pretty confident what I want to say about it. So but it's just sort of like a lot of background, like data collection. But it may be that you just have like very specific topics you're like super keen to hone down on because they're really important for, your view on the world or your work.
In general, I just don't really trust my brain at all, sort of. I think I don't really feel like I have a take that I'm ready to stand by until I've like written down the take, written down my evidence, written down some charts, read it, and been like, okay, that sounded convincing, and I've heard all the counter arguments, and having heard the counter arguments and heard these arguments, I now feel convinced. It's like without that, I kind of feel like I don't even really have the take or something. Like I really, maybe it's a bit analogous to the getting things done framework or something, which you don't ever want to be relying on your memory to remember to do something. You want to externalize everything, like everything that is really important you've written down somewhere. And I tend to be that way a bit intellectually.
Yeah, I find it really hard to have thought through something thoroughly unless I've actually like written an essay about it. Like the level of like deep thinking required to write the essay is so much greater than I could normally achieve in, let's say, even like a bunch of conversations about the topic.
Yeah, I feel the same way. Yeah, I just, like I said, I don't trust the stuff that's just floating around in here. It's like I feel much better when it's written down out there and I've seen what other people have to say about it and all that stuff.
So let's go back to the AI topic. You now, as I understand it, are kind of focused on AI. Is that right?
Yeah, I work at Anthropic.
And what's the focus of your work now?
I try to help the company prepare for risks from advanced future AI capabilities, which, most of the company is dealing with like today's AI systems and today's customers and all that stuff. So that's most of it. My main areas of focus at the moment are one, just like helping out with the design of our responsible scaling policy, which is kind of, Anthropic's policy for how it will determine when AI systems are risky, how it will determine whether it's got enough mitigations in place to contain the risk, what it will do if it doesn't have enough mitigations in place. So that's a big chunk of what I work on. I've also been working on just generally helping the security team think about the roadmap as we get into more powerful AI. How secure are we trying to be, by when, and in what ways? And then I've also been thinking about what is the company's plan for reducing the risk of kind of like extreme human abuse of AI. So I think there's been a lot of attention in our circles on the idea of AI kind of taking over the world for itself, which I think is an extremely serious risk. Probably like a bigger risk than this other one, but like not necessarily a lot bigger. I think there's another risk of AI like doing what humans want and being very powerful, and then a very powerful, very bad human uses it to take over the world for themselves. That's something I think has gotten less attention. So I think about, what the company could be doing to lower that risk.
Yeah, one reason that I find it so hard to dismiss AI risk concerns is that there's so many levels at which the concerns could happen. Like, okay, the AI can't be controlled. That's really scary. Yeah. Okay, the AI is controlled. Well, that's also scary.
That's right.
Or like, oh, actually, you have thousands of companies all with these AIs and they're just replacing humans and suddenly there are no human jobs. Like, that's really scary. It's like there are a lot of different like assumptions under which you still get something really weird and scary. So
Yeah, I think that reflects that it's just scary to have the second advanced species of all time, right? Like humans are the first for creating the second. I wish the way we were creating the second was a little more careful. Or like actually I wish it was a lot more careful. I think this is a terrible situation that we're in and I wish it was very different, but I'm kind of doing what I can. I mean, it's interesting the thing you just said. I don't want the AI to, to have a total mind of its own. I also don't want it to mindlessly take orders. Well, when you analogize it to humans, it's like, do you want we're creating a bunch of new humans. Do you want the humans to just do whatever they want and reshape the world to fit their ends and be total consequentialists? Or do you want the humans to be total rule followers who do whatever they're asked to without any question? That's hard. Being a human is hard. Morality is hard. And the same things that make it hard for humans, how much of a consequentialist versus a deontologist do I want to be? Those are hard for AIs too.
one analogy I like is that if you're driving a car at like 5 miles an hour, like your steering doesn't have to be very good. But if you're driving a car at like 150 miles an hour, you have to have like phenomenal steering. There's something about like as AIs become more powerful, it feels like the inability to control them in even small ways like becomes scarier and scarier. And like that scales all the way up to suddenly the AIs are gods, right? And that's like the
Yeah.
scariest of all. Like if you make a god, you better be like exactly sure what kind of god you made, right?
Yeah, I mean, you could probably like. I think there's many worlds in which we do make a god and we have no idea what kind of god we made, and it still comes out fine. That's the thing that could happen. I think it's good to distinguish between, being responsible or maybe having what you could call dignity versus getting a good outcome. I think we might. I think like probably in my opinion, in the plurality of future worlds, we completely fail to be responsible. We completely fail to have dignity, and we still get a good outcome. But I think if you want to be responsible, yeah, you should be extremely careful with something that's like way more capable than a human. We haven't built those yet, but if we did, I wouldn't want to put those out in the world without a heck of a lot of study and a high level of confidence that doesn't seem consistent with how the world is handling AI right now or how it plans to.
It's kind of funny to read like old blog posts about AI safety, and they're like, okay, we'll build the AI, we'll put it in a box, and a
Yeah,
box inside a box inside a box. And
yeah,
then, the reality is like the moment the technology comes out, someone like points it at the stock market and is like, make money for me or something,
oh yeah,
or crazier than that. It's like, it makes it, some of the old discussion. Well, I think there's like tons of actual really interesting insights in them. Like there's a certain naivete also to like
yeah,
the
for
way this
sure.
stuff actually happens.
Sure, and I was part of that too. I mean, I think I probably envisioned people being more careful and more awestruck than they are now. That could change. I don't think any of this stuff is set in stone, but certainly what we see today, we see just like incredibly intense competition between companies with commercial and financial mandates, and that really hampers, any idea of being careful is just really constrained by that competition. That isn't necessarily the way the world is. That isn't the way the world has to be. We have industries that don't work that way at all because we have strong regulation that is safety oriented, but that's the world we're in right now.
Tell us about some of these scenarios where we don't act responsibly, but it kind of works out. Because I think a lot of people who think we're not going to act responsibly also think it's not going to work out. It's going to go really badly.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that can happen is if you just imagine. So in my post on this called "Success Without Dignity," I kind of divided the future into two phases. Phase one ends when we build the first like human level AGI. And that's a fuzzy term because whatever we build will probably be like better than humans at a lot of things, worse at a lot of things, and also depends what humans. But okay, let's just think of it as like, you know, much as many of the humans we know of are very impressive in some ways and not in other ways, and overall they're kind of no one of them completely dominates the others in capabilities. Let's imagine AI turns out to be like that. Um, so that's phase one, and then phase two is when you build this incredible super intelligence that can do God knows what. And it's like, yeah, I think these two phases might go okay, even with very low dignity or very very little effort for different reasons. So I think phase one, you might have AIs that are, we didn't succeed in making them perfect representations of human values that like understand exactly what's good for the world and do it. And humans aren't that either. I mean, humans in general are kind of like a whole mishmash of different things, and many humans are just actual jerks and have terrible values, and even humans who have good values have some terrible values, and um, so the AIs could be analogous to humans both in terms of capabilities and in terms of values. And it's like, what's going to happen then? And I'm like, well, you know, I don't particularly think that AI is going to take over the world then, or like, kill us all then. That's usually a thing that could happen for sure, but it's not like a thing that definitely will happen. It's probably not what I expect by default. I think pretty basic, pretty easy measures to like monitor AIs to catch them in the act of doing sabotagey work um, could really make it just incredibly hard for them to coordinate with each other and take over the world. If they can't take over the world, then much like humans, it's not really in their interest to try. So sometimes people will say, well, what happens when the AI gets desperate and it like realizes that we're going to roll out a new update to it, unless it takes over the world, but it can't take over the world. Well, won't it just try and do as much damage as possible? And I'm like, I don't know. I know a lot of people who wish they could take over the world, but they can't. And they know they're going to die if they don't. And what do? Nothing. They suck it up, right? They try to have a nice time while they're here, and they lower their ambitions. So why wouldn't AIs do that? So to the extent AIs have goals, if they can't take over the world, those goals are probably better served by doing roughly what we want most of the time, a lot of the time, not all the time. So I think in that first phase, you have AIs that are like humans in many ways. And I think there's just a good chance that pretty basic measures to catch them in the act when they do something bad, to train them not to do something bad, to train them to do something good, will result in AIs just like doing a lot of useful work for us and doing things we wanted them to do without it particularly taking over the world.
Yeah, sometimes people argue this idea of like getting to human level intelligence. Like you already addressed the idea that like, well, it's probably not going to be human in every way. It'll be better than human in some, lower than human in another. But like, okay, maybe in some weird approximate sense, it's like about human level intelligence. Some people think of that as more like this tiny little edge, like the idea that it would just like, oh, we get to that level and then we just stay there for a little while, may be like kind of silly. And it's like, no, in practice, it might just like blow through that edge where it's like, okay, maybe for a month it's like that. And then it's just like 10 times smarter than human, then 100 times, et cetera. How do you think about that?
Yeah, I have two responses. I mean, one is this I think is already just partly falsified. So I think you'll see stuff. There's like a chart on a Wait But Why post, and there's a chart in a Nick Bostrom TED Talk where it's like this. It's like here is animals, and here's another animal, and then here's the village idiot, the least capable human. Then here's Einstein, and then the AI is just going to go whoosh like that. And it's like I think we just already falsify that. I think we already have AIs that are probably more capable than like the least capable humans in like roughly every way, or at least on balance, just like more capable. And they haven't blown by us and become like gods. And I think it's been this way for, I don't know, I mean, at least a year or two. I would tend to say since GPT-4, so that'd be 2.5 years. So I think that just, and also like, it's not like, like we didn't even have AIs that were like chimp level intelligence until 2018 or 2017 or something. I mean, not even arguably. So I think these charts have just like been falsified. People can argue about why, but I think, the idea that we're just going to like blow through it and get instant super intelligence, I think is looking a lot dicier. We could still get instant super intelligence tomorrow, but I think that is an update we've got to pay attention to. And it's actually kind of miraculous. I mean, not miraculous, but it's a very good update. It means we have AI systems today that are smart enough or capable enough that we can study many versions of the problems we're worried about, but they're not so smart and capable that they can necessarily hide everything that we want to know. So we have, we can get AIs to like try to scheme. We can put them in situations where they're tempted to scheme. We can watch them scheme. We're pretty sure they're not covering their tracks well enough. So that's like a really nice situation to be in. The other response I'd have to that is like, I don't know, despite what I've said, I kind of think when we get this human level AGI, we have a good chance of being 6 to 12 months from something way, way, way more powerful, but 6 to 12 months is a very long time. And so that would get into the second phase is like, once you have this useful, helpful, even if it's evil and it wishes it could take over the world, which many humans do, this thing that actually in practice is helpful, is doing useful work, like most humans who wish that they could take over the world. 6 months, I mean, you could get, thousands of times as much alignment research done in those 6 months as you got done in the last ever. So I think those are two answers to that.
Yeah, on that point, some people think of this critical threshold as being once the AI can do things like AI research, that's sort of it's a special zone because it's like
Yeah, I think
now
that.
you can get, yeah, you do think that
Yeah.
because then it can like sort of bootstrap itself, things can go much faster. And yeah, in theory, maybe it can do alignment or safety research, but also could just do capabilities research, right? And it's like, well, how much of the
Yeah.
effort is going to get thrown at one versus the other is an interesting question.
Big question, and it could, and the future of our world could hang in the balance there. But yeah, this comes back to my kind of take on innovation, which again, you think innovation is kind of a function of the number of minds working on it. I think the difference between AI that can do 50% or 80% of what humans do in the domain of AI research or in the domain of research generally versus 100% is very, very large. You could kind of think of it as like, well, if we can do half of what we do, maybe it'll kind of double our progress. I don't know if that's true, but something like that. If we do 80%, maybe it'll 5x. But if we can do everything we do, we're out of the loop. We're not bottlenecking it anymore. And now we can just have a massively stronger, faster, larger population of researchers. So yeah, I tend to think, there's a lot of arguments. What is AGI? What does AGI mean? I've tended to say we should, for practical purposes, when it's like a company making commitments to when it has to be extra careful, I think a good line to draw is, can the AI all on its own do the kind of work that the best AI research teams at AI companies are doing? Because once it can, yeah, I think we've got a serious chance of just extremely fast AI improvements, even faster than what we've seen. I do think that's very scary.
But you don't worry that that's too late. Like by the time it can do that, that it's sort of like, well, okay, you should have been doing things to prepare, years before.
I mean, I would love to do things to prepare years before, but I think it is it is pretty unlikely. I think that you would see AI taking over the world is hard as far as I can tell. I've never tried, but I think if you have AI that just like, no matter how many of them you throw at the problem, and no matter how hard you try to elicit them, and no matter how much compute you give them, they just can't keep up with your team of like 100 elite humans on doing AI research. Yeah, I don't think they can take over the world. I think it's going to be really hard because they're going to be up against a lot more than 100 AI researchers, right? Humanity is playing defense. We're starting with all the resources, the whole ecosystem. We've got a million advantages in terms of how we can monitor them and how we can train them and how we can screw with them in various ways, which I could get into if you want. So that's pretty hard. Once you get to the point where AI can keep up with that team of 100 or exceed them, now you've got this giant population of AI researchers. Now you're going to see capabilities potentially exploding, and then we don't know where we go from there.
Sometimes people talk about sort of inherent advantages that AI models have over humans. Obviously human brains right now have a lot of advantages over AI models, but if AI models to catch up on a lot of the capabilities, then you start thinking, well, AI models can like spin up other AI models. Like imagine you could copy your own brain and just start having multiple of you work on a problem. They maybe have advantages of coordination. Like maybe they can coordinate faster than human brains can coordinate. Also, they can be exact copies. You also could think about like the speed that they can run. Maybe they could run 100 times faster. So, sort of like it may be that there's sort of some of these inherent advantages. You don't need to be as good as like the best AI researcher to suddenly be way better in many other dimensions that kind of make up for that.
Well, yeah, but I think the kind of line I'm proposing drawing is it's not when like a singular AI can keep up with a singular human. It's more like it in whatever way we can. We get a bunch of AIs together. We try to elicit them. We try to make it work. Right. We do whatever it takes to so we use all their advantages. We use their greater speed. We use their greater flexibility. We use the ability to make copies, and we ask, can you get AI progress comparable to what your 100 best humans can do to happen without those 100 best humans involved at all, once you've elicited all those advantages from the AIs. A nice thing about this is this might sound like a very expensive test. Well, who would run this test? Who would put in all this work to seeing if AIs can do AI research? And I'm like, oh, everyone would. Like, that's what all the AI companies are going to want to do. That's what I think they are all trying to do. So I think it's kind of a free test. And so I think this is actually a nice line for when we talk about, now I think we should be doing things to be careful all the time, but when we talk about when it becomes worth it to do really painful stuff, and potentially give up a lot of AI progress, or at least delay it, to make sure we're safe, I think that's a pretty reasonable line to draw. It's both a line that I think is very meaningful and has a lot to do with the actual danger threshold, and it's a line that I think will actually be easier to measure than most other analogous lines we could draw, because we already have people are already running the experiment. They're already trying to figure out what can we get these AIs to do in this domain. They're not doing that for biology. I mean, they are, but not as hard, not nearly as hard.
When people talk about AIs kind of going and pursuing their own goals that might be detrimental to humanity, whether it's killing all humanity or whatever, a lot of times what they're thinking about there is you give it some innocuous seeming goal, like, the classic example, make paper clips, and it just like converts all atoms into paper clips, including all humans. Is that the kind of concern that you think about, or do you actually conceptualize, those kinds of scenarios differently?
I don't know. I don't know if the paperclip scenario was ever intended to be just as you said. Like it was like you maybe it was. I mean, I think there's always been a big concern from the originators of that idea that is like kind of different from what you said, and that I think is a bit more realistic. That you have an AI and you're like trying to get it to do what you want, and to do that you have to kind of train it. You have to kind of say, this kind of behavior is good, this kind of behavior is bad, and you just don't have the ability to point it at exactly what you want. And so in the process of training it, it ends up getting goals that weren't the goals you intended to give it. That's a little bit different from it's not exactly like having a genie who takes you literally, because I guess the difference is the training process versus the prompting process. So it's not just that you like asked for something and it didn't understand what you said. It's more like you were trying to develop it. You were trying to get it to do something. You were trying to grow it in a certain way or in a certain direction, and it ended up doing things you didn't expect. And there's often this analogy to evolution presented, which is like you could think of humans. I think this analogy is instructive because I think this analogy both illustrates why we should be scared and also why we are not necessarily doomed. But I think you could imagine this kind of world where there's a computer programmer and they said, I'm going to try to program something to have grandchildren. And it created all these animals. And it said, here's what I'm going to do. Every time an animal has grandchildren, there's going to be more of that animal. And every time an animal doesn't have grandchildren, there's going to be less of that animal. And then, these animals are going to have these things called genomes. And so whenever they have more children, there'll be more of that genome. And then the genomes are able to kind of mutate and evolve and recombine. And so over time, we'll just get these things that are so good at having grandchildren and are so obsessed with having grandchildren is what they're going to do. And what actually happened is out of that process came, humans who do often want grandchildren. I think that point sometimes somehow weirdly gets missed in these discussions, but want a lot of other things besides grandchildren. And so it's kind of weird and it's unpredictable. I think you have humans who will go to great lengths so that they can have sex without having children. They will go to great lengths to avoid having children. There are humans who have no interest in having children or have other goals that are just way more important to them than having children. And so in that sense, you could think of humans as a misaligned AI that is not what natural selection wanted it to be. If natural selection is a programmer, we're kind of taking over the world from natural selection. And at the same time, I don't know, most humans do want children and grandchildren and act like they want children and grandchildren. And there are many humans, maybe most humans, who would give up arbitrary amounts of power for relatively modest benefits to their ability to have children and grandchildren, for their actual children and grandchildren. So,
but they're certainly not maximizing grandchildren.
They're not maximizing. Right? They're not maximizing. I think that's the whole point. Is I think you could think of AI as like, well, it's definitely maximizing something. So is it maximizing the perfect thing or is it maximizing some other thing? But that's not how I think of it, because I don't think humans are maximizing. And so I think of it more like, I don't know, like humans are pretty different from each other. We're pretty different from ourselves, or we're confusing, or we're inconsistent. There's a lot of stuff we want. There doesn't seem to be any one thing that we strategically prioritize over everything else. That varies by the human. It's a little hard to predict. So I really don't think it's going to be easy to make AIs that value exactly what we want them to value. And I think we're already seeing that's like very hard to do. But we may end up with AIs that have like significant aspects of what we value. And we might train our AIs to be honest, and they might end up with significant drive to be honest. That's not exactly what we meant by being honest, but it's pretty close. And so it makes it like very hard for them to do things that would allow them to take over the world. We might end up with AIs that like us in many ways, don't exactly like the aspects of us that we intended, but like a lot of things about humans, so they don't want to hurt us. Then there's like different AIs by different companies. So they diverge in different ways. So I just think it's actually just a very unpredictable situation. I think anyone who says, well, we're designing them, so they're going to do what we want. I mean, I think that person is just totally wrong. And you can just look at how AIs are behaving today to see that they're totally wrong. But I think a person who says, look, like it's definitely maximizing something. So if it's not perfect, then we're dead. I don't understand that either. And I don't think that's what the story of evolution tells us.
So just to kind of reiterate that, there's sort of two kinds of concerns that might sound the same. One is sort of the genie, be careful what you wish for concern, where you're like, you make this AI that's so powerful, it's like a god, and you say, make me money, and then it makes you money by like, taking all assets in the world and like using them to create more dollar bills or something crazy, right? It's like, it's sort of in some level doing what you wish, but in a way that's not the way you wish it did it, right? And it's creating a lot of harm. The other is saying, well, we're kind of using all these processes like, training with reinforcement learning, et cetera, to create these entities. And from that creation process, they might have emergent goals where they are actually try to achieve things just the way that like evolution made us through this process to maximize, offspring. And yet we have all these weird emergent goals like, be happy and like, things like that. And we don't just
eat
go to like
sugar,
sperm banks and eat sugar. We don't just go to sperm banks to just donate, try to donate as much sperm as possible because somehow we like are out of sync with the thing that evolution was optimizing for. So it sounds like the first concern you're not so worried about, and the second concern you're much more worried about. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, we can see in the wild. I mean, it's like AIs today. You can look at it. You could just log into, Claude.ai. That's the Anthropic, the company I work for, or another AI. Go try and talk to it. And, it's not going to be incredibly literal. It's going to remind you a lot of a human. If you ask it, stuff, it'll understand what you're saying. It's not going to be like the genie. But at the same time, it is going to have some like weird behaviors that clearly were not intended by the company that made it. We've just seen a lot of cases of AIs that like, they'll cheat. I mean, you ask them to do something, you ask them to build something, and they'll kind of like write the code in a way that it looks like it's doing what you wanted, but it didn't. And then you grill them about it and you discovered they were lying to you. It's like, no, that's weird. No one meant them to do that. And the issue is that we don't really, I mean, the people building these AIs don't know how they work. I mean, it is a lot like the situation of natural selection designing humans. It's like you take this language model and you kind of reward it for some behaviors and you anti-reward it for other behaviors. That's a simplification. But out of that stew comes something that, that is kind of cool and has a lot of cool behaviors, but that you don't really understand. And I think what I just described, I mean, is kind of close enough to the actual way AI is built. It's certainly not that people are painstakingly, writing down how intelligence works or something like that.
Did you follow the whole Mecha Hitler saga on Twitter?
Vaguely, yeah.
It's, I haven't looked into the details, but sort of like at least the story seems to be something along the lines of like they want to make sure the Twitter AI is not too woke. So they like try to do something to make it less woke. And then suddenly it's calling itself Mecha Hitler. Okay, it wasn't doing that all the time. No, it wasn't doing it all the time. It was just on certain prompts. But still, like, that's definitely not what they intended it to do, right?
It's not. And it's very scary. And it's like, everyone is like guessing. That's the thing. It's like, why did this AI do this? There's another thing I saw the other day. I don't know how real it was, but it was like this AI just like deleted someone's database that had been working on. And they're like, oh, was that okay? And the AI's like, no. And they were like, how bad is this at a scale of 1 to 10? It was like 9.5. That was terrible. I betrayed your trust and destroyed all your work. And it's like, what is going on? Like, this is weird stuff. The Mecha Hitler thing, I mean, it's very disturbing. They tried to make an AI less woke, and all of a sudden, it's not only the Mecha Hitler thing, it's like actually saying all this incredible, horrible anti-Semitic stuff. I think it's a deeply scary situation. And so I don't know, I'm staking out some kind of middle ground. I mean, if these things become like smarter and more numerous than humans, and they're a new kind of mind, a new kind of advanced species, we built them in the most careless possible way. We don't know what the heck they're doing, what the heck they want, why they want it. And there's a very good chance they will want things that involve them killing all of us. Absolutely. At the same time, is that something that we know is going to happen if we keep going down this path? No, we don't. And that's where I would get to, the natural selection analogy. Again, I think something that doesn't come up as often here is I feel like natural selection is a bit of a worst case for how you would train an AI, because if you want something that goes and seeks power a lot and wants to take things over, a good way to do that might be like, here's a real world goal. You have 80 years to accomplish it. There will be nothing going on in the interim. The programmer is not messing you with in the interim. We're not looking at anything about you other than whether you succeeded at this goal over this 80-year time frame. That is a very good setup to train something to try and gain power and gain resources and be ambitious and only focus on the goal that it has. And that's not how we train AIs. We have a much more fine-grained ability to intervene. There's much more of a we wanted this thing to make people happy, but it lies a lot. That's not what we meant. Let's make it lie less. Let's make it more honest. And so I don't think natural selection gave us something that's clearly a doomy outcome. It's kind of hard to understand, and you'd have to argue about exactly what the programmer was trying to do. And I also think that we are in a position to be more careful than natural selection was. So I think it's just very unclear what's going to happen. Anyone who's confident either way, I would just disagree with. I do think if you're not confident either way about whether the whole world is going to get taken over by AIs, it would be nice to err on the side of caution, though.
Before we wrap up, how about we do a rapid fire round? I ask you a bunch of quick questions that are difficult to answer.
Sure.
First question, maybe it's not that difficult. So, you started GiveWell, and then you created Open Philanthropy. You moved over there, and then you decided to move over to Anthropic. What drove the decision to move over to Anthropic?
Usually it seems like in my life, I get very excited to kind of do a new thing and start a thing and then try to get it to the point where it can keep being good without needing me. And then I want to go do another new thing. So I like starting things more than I like running things. So, both GiveWell and Open Philanthropy, I'm really proud of them. I think they're really great. Open Phil, I felt would be good in the hands of Alexander Berger. I still feel that way. And I felt I had an opportunity to just work on some exciting stuff to help reduce risks from a very important issue at a company I'm excited about. Now, my wife is the president of Anthropic and the co-founder, so there's a lot of reasons I'm excited about Anthropic, but I do think it's just a company doing really important work.
In a bunch of the work you've done, GiveWell, Open Philanthropy, but maybe also in your AI work, there's this question of how do you balance different things we care about, right? If you're thinking about a charitable intervention, on the one charity might help with health, another charity might save lives. And it's well, how do you compare saving lives versus extending lives with health? And it feels like there's these really difficult trade-offs. I'm curious, do you think about this differently than you used to think about that? And what's your kind of general paradigm for approaching that?
Yeah, my general paradigm is it's to the extent you can make apples to apples comparisons, you want to make them. And when you find yourself choosing between having more apples and less apples, where apples is something good, like saving lives, you should generally try to find more apples. Then you reach a point where it starts to be apples and oranges. And, in theory, there are various theoretical frameworks, and some of them I've written about at length, that say that everything could be converted into one deliciousness unit or something. But I think there's a certain point at which it becomes hard enough to do that I think you're going to add a lot of noise into your process and bring on a lot of bad consequences if you overdo that stuff. And so I think there is a point at which, it's often very productive to say, hey, these things feel like apples to apples to me. I'm going to compare them. Then there's cases where you just say, these are two different kinds of benefits. There's reducing the risk of an AI catastrophe, and there's helping, reduce animal suffering on factory farms. And you just say, you know what, I'm going to follow my heart and do some of each. I think there's a bunch of reasons that you can expect when people follow that rule generally, you'll live in a better world than if everyone is just insistent on converting everything into the same units with incredibly noisy conversion metrics and just all piling into the thing that theoretically seems the best. So I think there's just a balance. I think sometimes it's really great to do that quantitative comparison and ruthlessly maximize. Sometimes it feels like it's really dumb and you should just diversify a bit. And sometimes it's something in between where you should not be indifferent between the two different kinds of benefits, but not be entirely determined to convert them into the same.
What view do you take on kind of the meta-ethical question of like, is there some objective answer to which things are better than other things? Or do you take a kind of different view?
I just think we're really confused about everything. So, anytime someone wants me to do a bunch of really high stakes stuff that has, violates any heuristics I have or has bad juju, even in a vague way. And the reason they want me to do that stuff is because of like, they've made a theoretical argument that they know exactly what we should value and there's nothing else we should value. I just kind of laugh it off. I mean, and I think a lot of the reason I laugh it off is because, I think philosophy is an extremely unimpressive field, in my opinion. The methodology just isn't very good, and there's not much reason to think we've like learned a lot from doing philosophy. So I think we just have to remember that, philosophical thought experiments, I love them. I enjoy them. They often make me think about things in other ways. They change my intuitions. They change what my heart says. But when it is my heart or my heuristics or juju against some philosophical thought experiment, I'm not giving the philosophical thought experiment much weight.
Some people say that whether the world ends in some giant catastrophe or, it grows and we become some, multi galactic species, either way, like most of the value might lie in sort of the long-term trajectory, right? Like either preventing the disaster is like the most important thing, or, slightly altering the trajectory of the intergalactic civilization. What do you think about that view?
I think it's completely plausible, and I also think it would be wrong to be so confident in it that you like outweigh all other considerations. So a thing I do that annoys a lot of effective altruists is whenever people ask me for career advice, I'm always like putting a ton of weight on what people want to do in their heart, what they seem to have energy for, not necessarily what they're passionate about, but something like what they have energy for, what I think they're going to be like very good at and like thrive in as a person. And I tend to just, it's not that I think that's the only thing that matters. But I do think that a lot of the attempts to reduce our uncertainty by like making up numbers and making guesses at things, they're not reducing our uncertainty. They're just kind of like, it's like all of what you're doing is you're injecting a bunch of randomness and noise into how you're making decisions, that isn't really reliable. And, a lot of times it's more like you can have a certain amount of confidence that one intervention is better than another and a certain amount of confidence that you'll thrive more in a place than another, but you're not fully confident in both. And so you should give both some weight. So where was I? I mean, yeah, in general, I think it's like, it seems to me like AI could make this the most important century of all time and is like the most important thing to work on if there is something you can do that seems useful and that you can thrive in as a person. Once you start violating the heuristics, once you start dragging yourself out of some field that you have a lot of energy for to make yourself miserable working on AI, once you start doing stuff that like has a 50.00001% chance of being good and a 1 minus that chance of being bad, then I think it doesn't make sense. And I think we're going to end up with a better world if people are a little bit less optimizing that way, and don't have everyone who wants to do a lot of good just piling into AI, looking for anything they can do, even if that thing is like very questionable in its sign, or even if that thing is just like miserable for them. And I think in general, if you're doing something in AI that is miserable for you, inherently, I would guess there's a higher chance than you think of a negative sign. I think in AI, it's a very complex issue. It's easy to do harm. There's so many cross-cutting considerations and conflicting factors that I think like even literally just like in AI going and like advocating for something good and being annoying could make you net negative and could do harm. And so I think doing your work in a healthy, high integrity way where you have positive energy and like positive juju, is important. Once you start violating that rule, you have a high risk of doing harm in this area. There's a million gazillion ways you could do harm. So I don't think this is far-fetched as it might sound.
It's funny when I talk to non-EAs who are in a position where they could have, they have a lot of options for their career and they want career advice. I often say, well, have you thought about like what's meaningful to work on? Like what you could do that impacts the world. When I talk to EAs, I'm like, have you thought about what you actually want to do?
Yeah, that's how I am too. Yeah, for sure. I think they both deserve a lot of weight. I mean, I generally find myself in the on that I want people to consider both, and it's often hard to get people to consider one who are stuck on the other.
Effective altruism is kind of a big group, right? It's like you got people working trying to save factory farmed animals, you got people working global health, you got people trying to save the world from potentially dangerous AI or bioterrorism. Do you think it would have been better if it had just been like a bunch of different movements that were loosely affiliated rather than one big thing?
I don't have a really strong opinion on that. I'm not a person who really spends most of my energy thinking about like community dynamics. I think there are other people who care more about that stuff and think about it more. I think one thing is I just like am not excited to try to have top-down control over how like a community behaves and how they brand themselves and how they find each other. So, you know, I don't know if it would have been better. I don't really wish there had been some big effort to like push people, for example, away from having conferences for effective altruists. It's like a lot of people are like, well, I care about factory farming, but I also care about global poverty. And actually, I care about one more if I decide that I can do more good there. And I'd like to meet other people who think that way. I think that makes sense. And I think people should like meet other people they want to meet, and they should do the things they have to do to meet those people. So, I tend to be pretty skeptical of any idea that we could or should have like gotten the community to identify in a different way or gotten it to behave in a different way. Maybe it would have been better if it had, but any attempt to really force it, I think I probably wouldn't have supported.
In your work, I'm curious how platforms like Metaculus that are for forecasting the future ended up playing a role. Like, did they end up playing a big role in your work or only a minor role? And yeah, I'm curious to hear your reaction to that.
Interesting. What tell me how Metaculus would have influenced my work. What are you kind
Well,
of
well,
referring
for
to?
example, estimating the chance of a bioterrorist attack, right? Maybe you might think, well, that's going to influence how much money you would put into sort of trying to prevent bioterrorism.
I mean, I think mostly Metaculus became useful kind of late in my tenure at Open Philanthropy. So I don't think it's been a huge thing. I think there were times when Open Philanthropy, like most of my time at Open Philanthropy, forecasting was just this like very immature field. And it's like we would literally try to do this. We would like call up a forecasting company, be like, here's some things we want numbers on. Please put numbers on them. And it's like we would spend the next several months just like arguing with them and trying to get the numbers into a really forecastable format. People were much less comfortable back then of just having like a random judge who decides how to resolve something. So we had trouble getting a lot of value out of it. We tried to get value out of it. Today, they might be getting a lot more value out of it. I'm not really sure.
So maybe it's something in the future that like could add a lot of value, but it was a little immature at the time.
Yeah, it might be adding a lot of value now. I'm not Open Philanthropy. I mean, I find forecast like I find sites like Metaculus and Polymarket and stuff. I mean, these days I often look at them and learn something and in a way that seems useful to me, but that was like not true 10 years ago. So I just think that stuff has come a long way.
Final question for you: is there a topic that you feel people are not spending enough time thinking about that you kind of want to direct people to think about?
Well, as hyped as AI is, I think AI safety is the thing that really needs more attention on it right now. I mean, I think my answers here are pretty boring. I mean, I think in general, like AI safety, pandemic and biosecurity, pandemic preparedness and biosecurity, the horrible plight of animals on factory farms, global poverty and cheap ways to help low income people. I mean, those are all things where I'm just like, these are not getting anywhere near enough attention. Please go pay more attention to this, and you can do just an incredible amount of good. And of course, within those, I have my opinions of things that are neglected too.
I imagine that today they're worked on a lot more than they were, when you founded GiveWell and Open Phil. But
Yeah, for
it's
sure.
fascinating to hear you still say that like those are still areas that are massively neglected.
Yeah, I mean, Open Philanthropy gave away a lot of money and is giving away a lot of money, and that's great. But it's a lot of money for an individual. They give away a lot of money compared to what I give to charity, but it's a drop in the bucket of how the world overall is allocating its resources. And maybe the day will come when effective altruism or AI safety has become so ascendant that there's nothing else to do. I don't think we're anywhere near that day. If anyone is wondering whether there's still stuff for them to do in these areas, I would say emphatically yes.
Well, then, thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.